Hi, I'm Anabel González, non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to Trade Winds, our bi-weekly virtual event series where we discuss the future of global trade in the era of the COVID-19 pandemic with leading policymakers and experts from across the world. Our episodes normally run the first and third Wednesday of each month, and we are very grateful to have a large and diverse audience spanning over 50 countries across all regions, 56 to be exact, from the US to China, from Switzerland to Tanzania, from Turkey and Vietnam to Costa Rica, my home country, and beyond. So I want to take a moment to recognize and thank all of you in the audience for your support and keep coming. In this, our fifth episode of Trade Winds, we will explore the topic China and the WTO, current issues and prospects for reform, a theme that is critical to the future of global trade cooperation and the multilateral trading system itself. So to lead our conversation today, I'm very honored to have with us two great speakers. First, let me introduce Ambassador Xiangchen, China's ambassador and permanent representative to the WTO. With a long and distinguished experience at the Ministry of Commerce of China, Ambassador Yang started his career as a leading aide to China's chief representative for GATT WTO accession negotiations back in 1992. So Dr. Yang has been involved in WTO issues longer than China has been a member of the WTO. So clearly, he's a top expert. Ambassador Yang is joined by our own Chad Bown, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, and the star, along with Samaya Keynes, of the amazing podcast Trade Talks. So if you have not heard about Chad or Trade Talks, this is about time for you to come back from Mars right away. So welcome to both of you, and thanks so much for being here with us at Trade Winds. I will turn it over to Ambassador Yang and Chad in a moment. For you in the audience, please get ready to submit your questions using the Q&A feature in the platform. So after 15 years of long and hard-fought negotiations, on December 11, 2001, China officially became the WTO's 143rd member, marking a major step forward in global governance and paving the way for China's full integration into the global economy. Since then, China has become a major player, the leading merchandise trader despite global trade tensions, with a share of 13% of total exports and 11% of total imports in 2018, and the world's second leading trader of goods and services in that same year. The WTO has been instrumental to China's trade rise, providing a framework for greater certainty, stability, and increased market openness. China has become, in its own right, an active and influential player in the organization. But China's economic policies have also been a source of tension between WTO members. Disputes against China frequently target government efforts to support and subsidize its manufacturing and high-tech sectors, and its negative spillover effects in markets around the world. Other countries' policies and practices, for sure, have also brought increased pressure to the WTO, and as we know, things are not looking good for global trade cooperation. In this context comes COVID-19, and with it, significant disruption to trade and global value chains, demanding more, not less collaboration among governments to tackle its devastating effects. So let me now turn it over to you, Ambassador Yang. It has been almost 20 years since China acceded to the WTO. During this period, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty and transformed itself into the trade powerhouse that it is today. And the multilateral trading system has played a part in this outstanding performance. So I wanted to ask you, what has been China's experience in the WTO? How does China assess the current state of play and future of the trading system? And in your view, how do you see China's role in the multilateral trading system today? So over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Anabel, for having me. I follow PIIE trade wins quite often. And hello, Chad, it's good to see you online. I assume if we had the same topic of China in the WTO several years ago, it would not gain popularity. But now it's different, since the only superpower in the world is not satisfied with the WTO. And the dissatisfaction, to a large extent, is related to China. I would like to share with you my observations from the perspective of China, the US, and the WTO. Let me start from China. I graduated from college and began my career in 1992. And ever since then, I had been a member of the negotiation team for China's resumption of GATT, seats, and WTO accession, as you mentioned at the beginning, till the very end of the negotiation in 2001. As a witness to history, I was very impressed by the enthusiasm and the humility of the Chinese people across the whole country showed towards the WTO rules. Thousands of books were published, thousands of laws and regulations were revised, and hundreds of thousands of people had been trained and to learn more about the WTO. Since then, we worked as hard as we could to fulfill our accession commitment and made our contributions to the negotiations such as trade facilitation and ITA expansion. And after 18 years, China has transited from a learner to a user of the WTO rules. In spite of the severe challenges ahead, the Chinese people generally remain enthusiastic about the multilateral trading system. However, there is now criticism against China for taking advantage of the WTO to profit at the expense of others. Such argument doesn't only contradict with the fact, but also greatly disappoints many Chinese people. Indeed, the China's economic system is a unique one, but it's not necessary that be different automatically warrants violation of the WTO rules, as alleged by some. It is also not true that the Chinese economic success is linked to the government intervention in its economy, as argued by some others. In fact, the relationship between the government and the market has always been a difficult issue for China to tackle. In areas where excess government intervention exists, reform is underway, which was highlighted by the third plenary session of the CPC 18th Central Committee. And it's no doubt that we will continue to advance our reform. The WTO is not omnipotent. The hope that it can address all issues, especially geopolitical issues, is simply unrealistic. The so-called incompatibility between China and WTO rules is a false proposition. Any WTO reform will lead to a dead end with that kind of premise. One of the purposes of China's accession to the WTO is to have an equitable international trading environment, and we will not go along with anyone to set tailor-made rules like a strict jacket for China and force us to change our economic system. And let me turn to the US side. Prior to my post in Geneva, I was the Vice Minister of Commerce for several years, responsible for Sino-US economic and trade relations. I therefore had many opportunities to travel to the United States with certain level of dissatisfaction of American companies and ordinary people with globalization is growing. We cannot deny that the uneven distribution of the benefit brought about by trade liberalization is a big problem. It's a big problem, but it is a problem for us all, not only in the United States. The workforce is suffering in sectors that lost the advantage in global competition. When not being properly dealt with, some politicians chose to point fingers and search for scapegoats, be it China or the WTO. These efforts to divert people's attention may be effective for a certain period of time, but the structural problem at home still remain. In this regard, I concur with Charles' recent comment that for policy priority that really matter to the American workers, trade policy is simply not the answer. And the notion that the WTO undermines US sovereignty is a straw man. Coming to the WTO, I believe that the WTO's current crisis is the result of a deviation from its core values and basic principles. Frankly speaking, I wouldn't think a few years ago that someone could bluntly disregard the MFN principle and even paralyze everybody. For those who believe the multilateral trading system, this is undoubtedly painful. Chad, I share your conclusion in your article last week that trade wars and high tariffs are becoming new normal. Unfortunately, such kind of new normal, like high tariffs, not only does harms to the US trading partners, but also hurts the American people. For WTO, to increase tariffs will defeat the purpose of the multilateral trading system, which is mandate to reduce tariff worldwide to make trade easier. The idea to increase tariff is as incompatible with WTO as fair and water. So the new normal is abnormal. We need to work together to change it. Of course, we know it's not an easy task. However, abiding by the promise should be the premise of WTO reform. On other WTO reform items, some may think that both the China issue and the US issue can be resolved under the WTO framework. Let's be frank, this kind of thinking will only overwhelm the WTO. We need to be realistic on what we can do and what we can't. And today's difficult circumstances, we need to keep calm rather than running around like a headless chicken. Compromising the WTO with unilateralism and protectionism is obviously not the way out. I want to be clear that it's a wrong move to target China's economic system in WTO reform. As I often said, that the WTO rules are only a small cage which cannot fit into a behemoth like a country's economic system. On the positive side, it's fair to say that the WTO can play a role in addressing trade frictions between China and the US, but only within its limits and with its right direction and the proper method. The future direction for the reform should be in line with the development trend and the rules of globalization, which I believe most members would support. Towards that direction, we will need to further promote the liberalization and the facilitation of both trade and investment and make the WTO more authoritative and effective. Having said that, China and the United States do have shared interest in the WTO reform process. The two countries both anticipate meaningful reduction and the capping of fishery subsidies by major subsidizers. We are both participants of e-commerce negotiations, expecting to reach a meaningful outcome. We both support enhancing transparency, actively discuss the service domestic regulation, strive for the improvement of licensing approvals, so on and so forth. China stands ready to cooperate with the US colleagues serving the interests of our two countries as well as the rest of the world. And Bill, let me just stop here. I know you and audience are interested in some hot issues like industry subsidies, developing country differentiation, and I will touch upon at a later stage of this program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your introductory remarks. I think they were very enlightening, and we will get to some of the topics that you mentioned. But first, let me turn it over to Chad. Chad, you are a WTO expert. Not only did you work at the WTO, but you have been following this issue for a very long time, and for sure, the trade confrontations between the US and China. So what is your takeaway from this 20 years of China in the WTO for China, for the rest of the world, for the trading system at large?
So let me begin by saying thanks, Anabel, for the invitation to be here, and thanks as well, Ambassador, for taking the time to join us. It's a great pleasure. I think obviously the story about China's integration into the WTO and even before the WTO in historical terms is unequivocally positive for China, and even arguably for the world. It's helped China lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, become integrated into the global economic community. So by and large, it's a positive story. That being said, yes, absolutely, there are challenges with it. In many respects, it didn't play out in ways that maybe some had anticipated. Like any major, as economists would phrase it, economic shock in China, just sheerly because of its size, the rest of the world coming to terms with China being such an important player in the global trading system meant that the rest of the world was going to need to adjust. In the United States, Europe, everywhere. Their economies were going to need to adjust, but I think as the ambassador suggested, the rules are going to need to adjust as well. And we're still struggling with that. And I think we're only at the beginnings of figuring out what that ultimately is going to mean. So I think this is indeed a critical time for the World Trade Organization, for the multilateral trading system, to figure out what the future is ultimately going to look like. So I have a lot of concerns because I don't think things have been going well for the last 3 or 4 years. But by nature, I'm an optimist, and I think there are ways to figure this out, and I look forward to engaging with that. But what I think I wanted to turn to in the meantime, in order to get at some of these big systemic issues that I think both the ambassador touched on, and that I, before January, spent a lot of my time thinking about, worrying about, and trying to develop strategies to get us out of, we now have to deal with the immediate crisis, which is COVID. And so what I wanted to do is to ask the ambassador a specific question about that. And that's what the role that China and the WTO in trade might play in helping us deal with this. So let me take a moment, if you would mind, to share a couple of slides that I put together just to kind of provide a little bit of context for this. And I'm going to try to do this as efficiently as possible. So I think trade and the WTO have a role to play in helping us deal with the pandemic, obviously. China has a huge role to play in that. And China not only has a role to play in that, but potentially a leadership role in this whole thing. So let me try to tell this story. So obviously when, before the pandemic hit, the world, much of the world, at least the trading world, was largely reliant on China as a source of manufacturers for a lot of the medical equipment that it turns out we're going to need to fight this thing. Personal protective equipment, so garments, respirators, gloves, goggles, all of these things that healthcare workers need to keep themselves safe, to be able to treat patients, and increasingly workplace conditions are going to need to keep their workers in such safe as well. China is just a major player in this product space. Over 50% of a lot of these products, the trade in these products are coming out of China. Now, one of the problems here, and this is what I'm ultimately going to get to, is we don't actually have good information about production, how much different countries are able to produce themselves. We've got really great data about trade, but we don't know about production all that much. So this isn't the same thing as saying that 60% of the world's protective garments are produced in China. That's not this slide. This is saying 60% of what is traded around the world is coming out of China. But in terms of production, we don't actually have that kind of information. But before the pandemic, so this is 2019, a lot of China's exports of this type of equipment were going to high-income countries, rich countries, the United States, the EU, Japan, Korea, the UK, right? That was kind of the story in setting things up. But then when the pandemic hit in January and February, and for expected reasons, a lot of what China would normally supply to the world of these pieces of equipment were taken off the global market, right? The pandemic hit China first. China had a massive demand, internal demand for respirators and gowns and masks and gloves. And it stopped exporting these products, and it started importing a lot of these products as well. And that's just sort of a fact. And you look at the data and you can see that. The last time I updated this was a little over a month or so ago. Things had been improving in March, but sort of, January and February were not great at all. And even when things started to come back online in March, China's exports, prices for a lot of these things had gone up. Things have subsequently improved since then, as China has gotten its own medical situation under control and been able to export more to the world. But this was part of the backdrop of what led to the crisis initially. And it's not only the rich countries that were buying this stuff from China. There's a lot of developing countries out there in the world as well that are particularly reliant on these types of products. They don't have any domestic production capacity. So I have a chart here that shows, a lot, and it's all around the world. It could be sub-Saharan Africa. It can be the Middle East. It can be Latin America. China is just a major, major player here. So when all of a sudden these supplies were taken off the market for, perfectly understandable reasons, then you led to all sorts of bad behavior by policymakers around the world that were suddenly fearful about not having enough of any of these supplies. So we saw European export restrictions, export curbs on PPE. We saw the United States doing these things as well. The upshot was in the trade community, at the moment where countries needed this equipment the most and needed openness the most to be able to get it from other sources, all of a sudden countries around the world were shutting off supplies and shutting this down. So I think as the trade policy community, we need to recognize this, and we need to step in and we need to deal with this, right? We need to show some leadership here. And so there's been a very interesting proposal by Professor Simon Evenett and Alan Winters, and hopefully the ambassador will be able to tell us what kind of traction these kinds of proposals are getting in Geneva. We've seen some discussions coming out of Canada, New Zealand, Singapore, things like let's not do export restrictions. Countries that have lowered their tariffs to allow in PPE or other types of medical supplies. Let's keep those tariffs low. Let's make commitments to keep those tariffs low. But to my mind, I think it needs to go beyond that. And I think what's really worrisome and really needed in this particular instance is governments were fearful. Governments remain fearful. They don't know what types of products are out there and available. And that's just because we lack data. We've got decent trade data that comes in with a lag, but we lack a lot of information about who has the capacity to produce what, who is producing what, how much is being consumed, how much is being traded. And so to my mind, we need not only transparency and commitments on transparency in terms of government policies, the normal things that the WTO requires, notifications about changes in your tariffs, imposing export restrictions, but we need to go beyond that. And so for guidance here, what I've done is to kind of look back to a period with some similarities, the 2008, 9, 10 period where we had the food price spikes, the commodity price spikes that led to a really worrisome period where governments imposed similar sorts of export restrictions on food, wheat, rice. That led to global prices going up even more shortages, even more export restrictions. At the end of that episode, what happened was the group of 20 got together and established a new transparency monitoring mechanism for agriculture, this thing called the AMIS, the Agricultural Market Information System, which provides more than just information on policies, but actually market conditions, how much countries are producing and consuming, what they have in stockpiles. And I think there's an argument to have the same kind of information being provided here today when it comes to these very, very critical medical supplies. If we want countries to remain committed to an open trading system and not have to try to produce everything themselves, then you have to reassure them that when it's their time to be in need, the supplies are going to be out there and they're going to be available. And I think we all have a role to play in this, but I think China has especially the opportunity here to play a leadership role, given how important it is as a global supplier and a global trader in these products. It's obviously in its own self-interest to reassure the global community that its supplies will be there. And so my question for the ambassador is, would China be willing to take on these sort of transparency commitments that might set the stage for other countries to be willing to do the same thing too. And so with that, we'll get back to other items, but with that, that's where I'll leave things for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chad, and thanks for jumping directly into the kind of questions that we'd like to pose to the ambassador and hear his views, and particularly on this critical point that you're making on the role of the WTO in contributing to the recovery from the COVID-19, and on the specific proposal that you were making, not only in terms of members adopting commitments on import reduction and curbing exports, but in particular in this area of transparency. So, Ambassador, shall we turn it over to you now and hear your views about this point?
Thank you. Thank you, Chad, for your analytical work. It's very insightful. First of all, I would like to say, as among the first countries hit by COVID-19, we are very grateful for the generous support and assistance provided by international community. And meanwhile, we strive to make our own contributions to the global fight against the pandemic. From March 1st to April 30th, China exported a total of 71.2 billion yuan of anti-pandemic supplies, including 27.8 billion masks, 130 million gowns, 73.41 million test kits, and 49 100 ventilators. It's obvious that no individual country, including China, is able to stand alone in the face of such a global crisis. Only through strengthened collaboration and coordination can we go through the difficult time. And Chad, you are absolutely right that trade data is crucial. Transparency is crucial. In responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, more than 10 analytical reports related to the COVID-19 and the world trade has been published. WTO has keeping monitoring members policy. As of July 10th, 105 members had notified 249 goods matters related to the pandemic. For service trade, 104 matters has been notified by 47 members. So China, in this regard, we will do our part to notify the matters we introduce in our countries. At the same time, we have the concerns about some members' matters, which is related to the planning of implement measures to localize production and bring manufacturing and service back home by means of including provide subsidies and tax reductions required by local and tighten foreign investment screen with a view to realize self-sufficiency. I believe that the global supply chains are shaped by and evolve through their own inherent rules in line with changing circumstances. I doubt this kind of a reassuring strategy will serve the interests of initiating countries and their trading partners. So further analysis and discussion may be needed for those countries. China is very interested in the WTO about some members' proposal to initiate a discussion on eliminating trade barriers on medicine and medical products. Some call for revisiting the TRIPS flexibility to ensure the members, especially the developing ones, to get the medicines and medical products in an affordable and timely manner. We are very interested in all these areas, and as proposals, you will find China in any initiative related to response to the COVID-19. I couldn't say that China would like to play a leadership role, but we would like to play a collective role together with other WTO members in fighting against the pandemic. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your comments. It's clear, I guess, that one important role for the WTO in going forward is thinking very hard about how to respond to COVID-19 and how can trade rules support members in dealing with the pandemic. But there are also other issues that are critical in the organization right now. And one of them, both you and Chad had made reference to the need of reforming the WTO. Basically, I think to make sure that it can continue to have a central role in the trading system. And here there are a couple of questions that I'd like to pose to you, and I'm going to take also a question from the audience. One, we have here Carlos Primo Braga, and he wanted to know whether China would support plurilateral agreements based on critical mass or MFN concepts as the next chapter in revitalizing the WTO. So that's, I guess, one part of the discussion of reform. And the other part, and I know each of these topics, we could spend, 3 hours talking about each one of them. But the other topic relates to the appellate body. We have a couple of questions here, people wanting to know. Roman wants to know whether China has a proposal for appellate body reform. It's also interesting understanding China's views on the multi-party interim arbitration mechanism. And Simon Lester is asking, will China nominate an arbitrator for the NPIA? And of course, people would want to know who, if that's the case. So let me stop here, Ambassador, and turn it over to you for your comments.
Okay, thank you. With regard to the WTO reform, it's no doubt that the WTO is facing severe challenges and the necessary reform is needed. However, members have not had a common will yet with regard to the direction, method, and the principles of the reform. As I mentioned, China is an advocate of reforming the system. In our view, fighting against the unilateralism and the protectionism is the priority. The reform of WTO is now to reinvent the view. The core values and basic principles need to be preserved, and the process should be incremental and inclusive rather than serving the interest of one member or small group of members. On the appellate body, it unfortunately is under paralysis. So the MPIA you just mentioned is an interim and stopgap mechanism in such a difficult time, rather than a replacement of the appellate body. Its primary objective is to preserve the binding nature of the WTO dispute settlement system and secure the appeal right of participating members. I would like to make a clarification. The MPIA is an initiative led by European Union. China works closely with the EU on this matter, but we are just a participant. I state in such a way so as to respect the intellectual property of the European Union. The restoration of appellate body is feasible only if the US can meaningfully and constructively engage in the discussion with members. We have established the daily worker process, the General Council chair and the formal DSP chair to seek to engage with the US on solution-oriented discussion. We're ready to hear from the US in its substantive feedback or counter proposals, so as to deepen the reform discussions and make it fruitful in the end. In spite of the numerous challenges ahead, I still firmly believe that the appellate body will come sooner or later. Certainly, it could be improved, and the members could address the issues such as the term of appellate body members, the deadline of jurisdictions, and the scope of review through consultations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I know, Chad, that you've of course written a lot of both of these topics of plurilaterals and the appellate body. I don't know if you want to say a word on this, because then I would also like to move to another topic, going a little bit more specific on WTO reform and discuss the issue of industrial subsidies. But before that, Chad, let me bring it over to you.
Yeah, so I was actually going to take the direction there as well. So maybe I'll talk about that and then anticipate your question, which I think is very much something I'm interested in as well. So to my mind, the fixing of the appellate body, at least from the American perspective, and dealing with topics like industrial subsidies were very much intertwined. And so the idea, I mean, so, so the biggest American grievances when it comes to the appellate body are decisions having to deal with trade remedies. Not only the past, if you're thinking about zeroing, but the future and concerns over the appellate body's interpretation of public body and countervailing measures types of disputes. But there, I think, where the biggest concern with the Americans would be in terms of the rule book, or one of the big concerns is on industrial subsidies and figuring out how we're going to navigate, this challenge in the bilateral relationship, but that is not a bilateral issue, right? It's a broader issue, and some of this on the U.S. side was been navigated through the trilateral process with the EU and Japan over the last couple of years. But my sense is we may have exhausted the thinking that subsidies can be dealt with bilaterally in the US-China context through these phase something negotiations. So it was time to begin to bring them to the WTO, potentially through a plurilateral agreement. So we were sort of there, right? That's where we were kind of in January. The momentum had maybe led us to that point, but then COVID hit. And so my question for the ambassador is, the world is an entirely new place now where everybody subsidizes everything. So if we thought that we were going to be negotiating about industrial subsidies from one point in time based on a world that existed back in, December or January, that world doesn't exist anymore. The United States, we're bailing out companies. The Europeans everybody's bailing out everybody. So how are we going to ever, to deal with these subsidies issues? Obviously, we got agricultural subsidies issues that need to be resolved as well. Do we need to wait for the subsidies and kind of for the economic recovery to resolve itself before we can engage in these types of issues? Or no, we need to push forward on these things now and make these types of concerns as well part of the conversation about what acceptable disciplines for subsidies as well as reform to the appellate body might ultimately look like.
So the question is whether COVID has actually changed the landscape in terms of industrial subsidies, which we know has been a challenging topic for many years. It's certainly agricultural subsidies as well. But the question is, are we here at a changing point, and is there anything that we can do about it? So, Ambassador, you want to comment on this?
Yes. Actually, as Chad says, the pandemic changed everything. We need to pay attention to the dynamic bilaterally, multilaterally. To be frank, major powers like the United States and China can live without participating in or quitting from international organizations. But that's not our objective. What we want is not just to live, but to develop further and achieve common prosperity with other countries in the end. That, in my opinion, requires globalization and cooperation, especially under the current circumstances. We recognize enormous difficulties the WTO is encountered with, but also believe its historical mission will not and should not come to an end. China is more than willing to improve the organization together with like-minded partners to strengthen global trade cooperation and collaborations. With regard to the industry subsidy, I agree what Chad said. It's not a bilateral issue. No bilateral mechanism can address this issue. If we have the common will to address the issue, we have to deal with this issue in the multilateral framework. But the issue of industry subsidy is indeed a contentious one and a complex one. As a larger trading nation, China will responsibly consider the externalities of its economic policies. China has never rejected the discussion on industry subsidies. But I have to be very clear that to launch negotiations in the WTO to amend the current ASCM, the subsidy code as proposed in the trilateral process is a non-starter. For example, with regard to the reversal of the burden of proof suggested by the trilateral statement, a fundamental principle on this issue is acting cubit probatiu, or in English, the proof based on the plaintiff, which means the burden of proof resides upon the party who asserts the affirmative of a particular claim or defense. The reversal of the burden of proof to the respondent will bring greater injustice. We all know that it's much harder to prove something does not exist in the world than to prove its existence. In practice, it's almost impossible for the country who have subsidies to prove that their subsidies do not have any negative effect on the interest of another party, and that they have no negative impacts on trade and the production capacity. Only importers directly affected by the subsidies are capable of understanding and demonstrating the adverse effect. And of course, besides this technical issue, we have more fundamental concerns. For example, I will not accept such a narrative that the root cause of the WTO crisis is China. The perception contains misunderstanding and exaggeration of China's way of realizing economic development. And according to my understanding, it's a kind of appeasement to unilateralism. And secondly, I don't go along with the notion that China's industry development guidelines is evidence of providing harmful subsidies which should be prohibited, whereas at the same time, the practice of other countries arbitrarily attacking Chinese companies in the name of national security can prevail. And thirdly, I think that we all have to respect everybody's ruling on the distinction between state-owned enterprises and the public bodies. To equalize two concepts is both unfounded and ill-willed. China's state-owned enterprises are being targeted unfairly and discriminatorily in some countries. They are either being restricted or completely kept out of the normal trade and investment activities. Of course, we can not accept some members to redouble their efforts to further crush our companies by arbitrarily labeling those companies as a quasi-government entity and apply countervailing measures on them. And finally, trade remedies are being abused by some members already. Countervailing measures are plaguing normal trade, and China is the largest victim of this abuse of rules. The new initiative on subsidies will further exacerbate this situation by amending the rules so as to make countervailing cases even more convenient. I think the right approach, in my view, is that before jumping into any biased conclusion, we need to assess the economic impact of subsidies. I think, Chad, we're on the same page on this point. On top of economic assessment, we also need to evaluate historical and the development aspects of subsidies and try to find a way to avoid discriminatory practice in formulating domestic industry policies considering the spillover effect. On trilateral statement, I have been following closely. I would rather not see it become a topic in the WTO. So I'm also aware maybe that is inevitable. So I'm ready for a civilized debate, and the only question is when the other boot will drop. I would like to offer an opportunity for the proponents to convince me. If they can convince me, they can go ahead. Otherwise, we will continue the debate. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I hope that the proponents are listening to you right now. So we have a couple of questions, if you don't mind, on this topic, which I want to bring in from the audience. We have Herminio Blanco, former Secretary of Trade from Mexico, asking, could the ambassador talk about the concept of competitive neutrality that has been mentioned by Chinese government representatives? And a very interesting question from a good friend, Will Martin, and also a WTO expert who's asked both Ambassador Yang and Chad, when you began your career, he says, 70% or more of exports were from SOEs. Now that share has fallen to around 10%, yet the policy discussion seems to focus mainly on the role of SOEs and export competition. Why? So this is, I guess, I mean, again, we could take more than 3 hours to talk about these issues, but maybe a quick comment from your side, Ambassador, and maybe Chad, you also want to come in after the Ambassador.
Okay, thank you, Anabel, and thank you for those questions. So with regard to the competitive neutrality, we are very interested in this concept and the substance. I spent a lot of time to discuss with, our Australian colleagues who invented this concept, and also the OECD experts about the substance and the relationship between the concept of competitive neutrality and the policies. And actually, my government has already transit some, the requirement of competitive neutrality into the Chinese domestic policies and regulations. We are very interested because we would like to level playing field, not only in the Chinese market, but also in the international market. The fair competition is the concept that accepted by Chinese people and the Chinese firms. But at this moment, for the concept itself, we cannot find a corresponding Chinese competitive neutrality. I don't know how to translate into Chinese. It's a very awkward if we have to have a translation. That's the state of play about this term and the substance. And I'm very happy that my friend Will Martin is online. He's a long-term friend, and World Bank, even before China's accession to the WTO, provided a technical assistance program first. I was the beneficiary of this project, and Martin was the one who organized this project. We rely in the past on the analytical analysis would have been done by Will Martin and other experts in WTO. And with regard to the current issue, the subsidy issues, as I just said, we need the economic impact of subsidies analysis. I think in this regard, the people like Will Martin, like Chad, like PIIE, the organization, they can do their part to provide a more analytical analysis and research to the WTO members, so we can take advantage and to promote our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Chad?
So yeah, Will Martin was my boss for a while at the World Bank, so I'm a huge fan of his as well, and he raises a really good question. Will, so why the emphasis on SOEs? I agree with you that a lot of it's misplaced, but not maybe for the reason that others would stay. I think there's a lot of focus on SOEs because it's something that we can kind of see, and lawyers like to write down specific rules. But I think that even if you were to write down rules that would somehow engage on the SOE issue, that wouldn't address a lot of the problems that we're seeing, or a lot of the areas of tension and conflict in the area of subsidies in particular. So, as an example, take aluminum, right? So the OECD put out this really fascinating report in 2019, looking at the aluminum value chain across countries. And there, the story is not the concerns coming out of China for the other aluminum producing countries aren't with China's SOE firms that sell aluminum. That's not it at all. But the SOEs do play a role. It's the Chinese state-owned banks that may provide cheaper than normal energy, cheaper than market price energy, or other inputs, right? So if it's primary aluminum, or it's other policies that create implicit subsidies through export tax restrictions, right? So as an economist, I get uncomfortable with trying to figure out how we can write down rules for all of these subsidies when creative policymakers are always going to be able to come up with some other policy that isn't a rule that you've written down to prohibit it if they want to do it. So, as an economist, you sort of need to write it sufficiently vague to say, I'll know the subsidy when I see it through its economic effects. But lawyers don't tend to like to write things down that way and trust us economists to be able to inform after the fact, right? But to the last point, I agree also entirely. We have to figure out economically on this issue of subsidies, both industrial and agriculture, which are the ones that are really important, which are the ones that are really creating challenges and international externalities and spillovers that we've got to deal with. And that's what needs to inform the negotiators in this process. Without that, and we lack that at the moment, we have no idea on what to prioritize. And I think that's really impeding our ability to work together to find a common solution.
But I think, this links to your earlier point on a totally different issue about the transparency, the need for more information, the need for better, data, because these are complex issues. And if the WTO is going to move forward in some of these issues, bringing in that data is going to be critical. And I think, Ambassador, you were talking in the same direction. So I have a couple of things, many things coming out in our questions from the audience. So we have two good Chinese friends that are bringing in another topic, which is also very relevant. So Professor Qin Tu has a question for Chad. If Biden won the election in November, what attitude would he have on trade relations with China and on WTO reform? And I know you're not a representative of the campaign, but maybe your views on this. And then I would like to link this with another question from another Chinese friend, Zhang Lu, which asks the ambassador, is there any chance for the US and China to cooperate on WTO reform? And what do you think about this? Or are we going to continue having more confrontations? So Chad, to you first, please.
Yeah, so I won't pretend to be able to know what the Biden campaign's position on this at the moment is, but let me tell you, if I were advising them, what I would tell them. And what I would tell them is these issues that we've been talking about can't be addressed bilaterally with China through some sort of approach like what we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years. These are issues that are multilateral in nature. So that means that we need to bring in the other major economies that have a clear vested interest and stake in this process. And so that is going to be the European Union, that's going to be Japan, that's going to be Canada, and a big chunk of the Geneva community. Now, does the entire WTO need to be involved over a conversation about industrial subsidies? Probably not. Right. And so this is why, my query for the ambassador was, how do we engage on this responsibly in a way that is, different than we had done things in the past? And I don't think the way we had done things in the past through big negotiating rounds are really the way to go. Some of these critical issues for the WTO system need to be tackled in smaller groups, or we run the risk of not making any progress at all. And if we don't make progress at all, then I fear the WTO becomes increasingly less and less relevant. So if I were advising the sort of a future Biden administration, I would give the WTO one last shot. But the way that I would give it is by engaging with a small collective group of countries on what I think are a number of critical issues. But also I wouldn't keep them in silos. I do think there are trade-offs to be made here, and I was heartened to hear the details of the debate that the ambassador clearly wants to engage on in these issues of public body and industrial. Like, we want to get at these things, but I don't think they can be left on their own. I think they do need to be packaged together with how do we fix the appellate body, how do we fix industrial subsidies, how do we fix agricultural subsidies. Bring a couple of these things together, identify the trade-offs where everybody is going to be seeing some wins. There may be some losses in trade negotiators speak there, but at the end of that process, I think everybody will be able to walk away from a deal that they feel is not only better for the world, but better for sort of their country as well. And I think that's the only way out of something like this.
Thank you, Chad. Ambassador, do you think it's possible to have WTO reform based on cooperation, the way in which Chad was mentioning, in a smaller group with the US and China, but others as well?
Thank you for the question. As I just mentioned in my initial remarks, China and the United States have great potentials for cooperation in the WTO. I just mentioned some of them: the fishery subsidy, the e-commerce, and other GSI, and as well as service domestic regulations. And in the context of combating COVID-19, as the main importer and exporter of global medical products, China and the United States should lead the way through cooperation to help each other and provide assistance to others, especially the most vulnerable ones. To be more specific, we should work together to facilitate the flow of medical products and minimize disruption to the global supply chains, explore ways to remove trade barriers, refrain from applying export restrictions, and expedite the transit of these items rather than going towards the opposite directions. It's not our intention to confront against the United States. We would like to cooperate with our US colleague in the WTO reforms. And I want to make my comment on the Chinese friend's question to Chad about the modality of negotiations. China is open and pragmatic as to negotiation modality. We agree what Chad said. We cannot use the old manner to conduct the current negotiations. If not all, groups of like-minded members may be allowed to discuss and explore the possibility to agree on something. In Geneva, we call it a joint statement initiative, or some people call it a plurilateral approach. However, I'm a fundamentalist of multilateralism. So I would prefer to call it a pro-multilateral process, because at the final stage, we hope we can achieve a multilateral end involving all 164 members. The process, no matter what it's called, has to be open, inclusive, and transparent, ready to accept outsiders from the entire membership. So we are open-minded. But as I said just now, on industry subsidies, we are not like-minded members with the trilateral statements members at this moment. That's the reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. My sense is that in going forward, this idea of the WTO, first looking at an agreement to help fight COVID-19 on the medicines and medical gear front is critical. But certainly when thinking about the recovery and all this massive subsidies that are coming in both industrial subsidies and agricultural subsidies, will need to be one critical point for the WTO to address in order to remain relevant, alongside with the reform of the dispute settlement for sure. Now, we have a few minutes left, and I just want to bring in a quick question for you, Ambassador. The WTO is immersed right now in the selection of the next Director General. So in light of all of that, what we have talked about today, what role do you see for the next Director General, or what would you expect from the next Director General? I'm not going to ask you to say who you're going to be supporting, unless you want to share, of course, but if not, at least, what would you like to see in the next Director General?
Okay, thank you, Anabel, and thank you for your consideration. I have to be very cautious at this moment because I want to be fair to each of the 8 candidates. You are right that this year's DG selection process is facing a lot of uncertainties, but the stakes are high. The whole world will be expecting a strong figure to lead the WTO out of the current crisis, both in terms of economic challenges posed by COVID-19 and also the existing problems long-lived in the WTO. We have to find a right person for this job. And members will have different considerations in their own assessment. However, one thing for sure will be a common criteria for selecting the new DG. That is the firm belief in the multilateral trading system with strong determination and adequate ability to bring WTO members together. To this end, we need someone who is able to shoulder that pressure from the non-believers and march on, well balance the interest of all members. We will make a careful assessment and the evaluation at this moment and actively participate in the subsequent process. And I think the priority for the new DT is to restore the function of the WTO, particularly the appellate body, and resume negotiations which will facilitate economic recovery after the pandemic. That's the top of the to-do list for the new DG. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Yang. And with this, I'm afraid that we have reached our hour. This has been a very, very interesting discussion, many topics, and I certainly hope to have you back, Ambassador Yang, and chat for sure to continue our conversations. So many thanks to both of you for a great and honest conversation. Thanks also to our audience. Visit us on Twitter, and please keep coming back and bring your colleagues and friends with you. Thanks to all of my colleagues at Peterson who make trade winds happen. And please stay tuned for the next episode of Trade Winds on Wednesday, August 5, with another interesting conversation. Until then, thank you all very much.